Only he helped. The fluorescent lights of Hanson's grocery buzzed overhead like tired hornets, casting their harsh glow across the worn linoleum floor. Sarah Chen stood frozen in aisle 7, her world spinning out of control as the familiar walls of anxiety closed in around her. The colorful packages of cereal and snacks blurred together as her vision tunneled, her chest tightening with each labored breath. It had started as a simple grocery run. Pick up milk, bread, and something for dinner. Nothing complicated. But somewhere between the produce section and the frozen foods, the weight of everything had crashed down on her like a tsunami of despair. The divorce papers she'd signed that morning. The foreclosure notice tucked in her purse. The medical bills stacking up on her kitchen counter like monuments to her mother's losing battle with cancer. 27 years old, and Sarah felt like she was drowning in a life that had become unrecognizable. The career she'd built as a graphic designer had crumbled when the economy took a downturn and her company downsized. Her marriage had fallen apart under the strain of financial pressure and her husband's inability to handle her mother's illness. Now, standing in this grocery store with exactly $37 in her checking account, she couldn't even afford the basic necessities on her list. The panic attack hit her like a freight train. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably as she gripped the shopping cart, her knuckles white against the metal handle. The sounds of the store, children crying, shopping carts squeaking, the constant beep of checkout scanners, became overwhelming, like a cacophony of noise drilling into her skull. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and she felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting sideways. Other shoppers moved past her with purpose, their eyes fixed on their own missions. A mother with 2 toddlers hurried by, juggling a phone call and a crying baby. A businessman in an expensive suit checked his watch impatiently as he grabbed items from the shelves. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they debated which brand of chips to buy, oblivious to everything around them. Sarah tried to move, tried to continue shopping, but her legs felt like lead. The simple act of choosing between 2 brands of pasta sauce had become an insurmountable task. Everything seemed too expensive, too complicated, too much. She closed her eyes and leaned against her cart, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. That's when she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. "Miss, are you all right?" Sarah opened her eyes to see an elderly man standing beside her. He wore faded denim overalls over a gray flannel shirt, and a well-worn baseball cap sat atop his silver hair. His face was weathered like old leather, with deep lines that spoke of decades of hard work and honest living. But it was his eyes that struck her most, kind, patient eyes that held no judgment, only genuine concern. I'm fine," Sarah stammered, though her voice betrayed her words. She wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed that a stranger had witnessed her breakdown. The man, who looked to be in his 70s, studied her face with the careful attention of someone who had seen enough of life to recognize pain when he saw it. He didn't push for details or offer empty platitudes. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Sometimes fine is the hardest thing to be." His name was Frank Morrison, though Sarah wouldn't learn that until later. He had been shopping for his weekly groceries, the same routine he'd followed for the past 5 years since his wife Martha had passed away. Milk, bread, a bag of apples, some ground beef for the meatloaf that would last him 3 days. Simple needs for a simple life. But Frank had noticed Sarah the moment she'd entered the store. There was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible weight, eyes scanning the prices with a desperation he recognized all too well. He'd seen that look before, during the Great Depression when he was just a boy, watching his own mother count pennies at the general store. As a young man, Frank had worked construction, building houses and hope in equal measure. He'd raised 3 children with Martha, weathered economic storms and personal tragedies, and learned that sometimes the smallest gestures could mean the most. He'd also learned to recognize when someone was at their breaking point. "You know," Frank said gently, "I was just thinking I bought too much for one old man. Got carried away in the produce section." He gestured to his cart, which Sarah now noticed was indeed quite full. "My late wife always said I had eyes bigger than my stomach. Would you help me out by taking some of this off my hands?" Sarah shook her head immediately. "Oh no, I couldn't. That's very kind, but I couldn't take your groceries." Frank chuckled, a warm sound that somehow made the harsh fluorescent lighting seem softer. "Well, I suppose you could pay me back by keeping an old man company while he shops." Haven't had a conversation with anyone under 60 in weeks. My grandkids are all grown and busy with their own lives. There was something in his manner, not pushy, not pitying, just genuinely kind, that made Sarah pause. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the way he looked at her like she was a person worth helping rather than a problem to be solved, but she found herself nodding. As they walked through the store together, Frank shared stories about his life in a way that felt natural rather than forced. He told her about the house he'd built with his own hands in 1972, about teaching his daughter to drive in the parking lot of this very grocery store, about the garden Martha had tended until the day she died. His stories weren't meant to minimize Sarah's problems or offer false hope, but rather to remind her that life was made up of small moments, both bitter and sweet. Martha used to say that people are like tea bags, Frank said as they stopped in front of the canned goods. You never know how strong they are until they're in hot water. He selected a can of soup and placed it in his cart. Course, she also used to say that about herself right before she'd do something terrifying, like volunteer to organize the church bake sale. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. It was the first genuine smile she'd managed in weeks. As they continued shopping, Frank casually added items to his cart that Sarah had been looking at longingly. Fresh vegetables, a decent cut of meat, some of the nicer bread from the bakery section. When Sarah protested, he waved her off with a story about how Martha always bought too much and how he still hadn't broken the habit. The other shoppers in the store moved around them like water around stones. A few glanced their way with mild curiosity, an unlikely pair, the elderly man in overalls and the young woman who looked like she'd been crying. But most were too absorbed in their own lives to pay much attention to the quiet drama unfolding in the grocery aisles. Sarah found herself opening up to this stranger in a way she hadn't been able to with friends or family. Maybe it was because he didn't know her story, didn't have expectations or judgments about what she should or shouldn't do. Or maybe it was because his weathered hands and patient demeanor reminded her of her grandfather, who had passed away when she was 12 but who had always made her feel safe and understood. She told him about her mother's cancer, how the treatments had drained their savings and her mother's hope in equal measure. She talked about the divorce, how her husband had left just when she needed support the most, claiming he couldn't handle the stress. She mentioned the job loss, the mounting bills, the feeling that she was failing at everything that was supposed to define a successful adult life. Frank listened without offering solutions or trying to fix anything. He just listened, occasionally nodding or making a small sound of understanding. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, examining a can of green beans as if it held the secrets of the universe. You know, he finally said, back in '82, I lost my job at the construction company. Economy went to hell, and they were laying off guys left and right. I was 43 years old with 3 kids and a mortgage, and I didn't know what I was going to do. He paused, placing the green beans in his cart with deliberate care. Martha and we'd just look at each other across the breakfast table some mornings, both of us scared out of our minds but trying not to show it. Bills piling up, kids needing school clothes, and me driving around town looking for work that just wasn't there. Sarah felt a connection forming, a recognition of shared struggle across generations. What did you do? She asked. Frank smiled, but it was a complicated expression, part sadness, part pride, part acceptance of life's difficulties. We did what people do. We kept going. One day at a time, one bill at a time, one small decision at a time. Found work eventually, not the work I wanted, but work that paid the bills. Took me 5 years to get back to where I'd been before, but we made it. They had reached the checkout area, where the real world was waiting to intrude on their bubble of conversation. Frank had somehow managed to fill his cart with enough groceries to feed a family of 4, while Sarah's cart contained only the few items she could actually afford. Wait here a minute, Frank said, and before Sarah could protest, he had wheeled his cart to the customer service counter. Sarah watched in confusion as Frank spoke quietly with the store manager, a woman in her 50s who seemed to know him well. They talked for several minutes, with Frank occasionally gesturing in Sarah's direction. The manager nodded several times, wrote something on a piece of paper, and shook Frank's hand warmly. When Frank returned, his expression was matter of fact, as if he'd just asked about the weather. Turns out the store needs some part-time help, he said casually. Stocking shelves, helping with inventory, that sort of thing. Pays decent, and the manager, that's Linda over there, she's good people. Flexible with schedules too, if you need to take care of your mother. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. You got me a job. Just like that. Frank shrugged. Linda and I go way back. Her husband used to work construction with me, and I helped her out when she was starting here 20 years ago. Good to finally return the favor. But Frank wasn't done. As they approached the checkout line, he began transferring items from his cart to hers, the vegetables, the good bread, the meat, the milk she'd been unable to afford. When Sarah started to object, he held up a weathered hand. My Martha always said that food was meant to be shared. And like I said, I bought too much for one old man. His voice carried the authority of someone who had made his decision and wouldn't be argued with. Besides, you're going to be working now. Consider it an advance on your first paycheck. The young cashier, a college student named Miguel who had been working at the store for 2 years, watched the interaction with growing amazement. He'd seen Frank in the store countless times, always polite, always buying the same simple items, always paying in exact change. But he'd never seen anything like this. As Frank paid for everything, Sarah stood beside him feeling overwhelmed by gratitude and disbelief. She tried to calculate how much he was spending, how much this kindness was costing him, but he seemed completely unconcerned with the total. Why? She finally asked as they loaded the bags into her car. Why would you help a complete stranger like this? Frank was quiet for a moment, loading the last bag with the same care he'd shown throughout their time together. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of lived experience. Back when I lost my job, we were down to our last $20. Kids were asking for things we couldn't afford, and Martha was trying to make meals stretch further than they should have. I was too proud to ask for help, too ashamed to admit we were struggling. He closed her trunk and faced her directly. One day, I was at this very store, trying to decide between buying milk for the kids or bread for sandwiches. Couldn't afford both. This stranger, never saw him before or since, he just walked up and handed me $50. Said he'd been there before and knew what it felt like. Frank's eyes grew distant, remembering that moment from 4 decades ago. I tried to refuse, tried to give it back, but he was already walking away. All he said was, "Pass it on when you can." Took me 30 years to really understand what he meant. Sarah felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the ones she'd been fighting all day. These came from a place of hope rather than despair. "I can't repay you," she said quietly. "Not asking you to repay me," Frank replied. "Just asking you to remember this feeling. Someday, when you're back on your feet, and you'll see someone else who needs help. And maybe you'll remember that sometimes a stranger's kindness can change everything." 3 months later, Sarah was settling into her new routine. The job at Hanson's grocery wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work with understanding management. Linda had indeed proven to be flexible with scheduling, allowing Sarah to take time off for her mother's appointments and treatments. The pay, combined with her freelance design work that was slowly picking up again, was enough to keep the bills manageable. Her mother's condition had stabilized somewhat, not improving, but not getting worse either. They had found a rhythm of hope and realism that allowed them to focus on making each day count rather than worrying about how many days were left. Sarah had also started therapy, using the employee assistance program the store offered. Dr. Rodriguez helped her understand that her panic attacks weren't a sign of weakness but a normal response to overwhelming stress. They worked together on coping strategies and slowly, carefully, Sarah began to rebuild her sense of self-worth. Frank continued to shop at the store every Tuesday, always buying his simple groceries and always taking a moment to check on Sarah. Their friendship had deepened beyond that first encounter. He told her stories about Martha, about the house they'd shared for 43 years, about the children they'd raised and the dreams they'd built together. Sarah shared her fears about her mother, her hopes for the future, and her slowly returning confidence in her ability to handle whatever life threw at her. It was on a particularly busy Tuesday that Sarah witnessed Frank's true character in full display. She was restocking the soup aisle when she heard raised voices from the front of the store. A young mother with 3 small children was arguing with Miguel at the checkout counter, her voice strained with embarrassment and frustration. "Please, I just need 10 more minutes," the woman was saying. "My husband is bringing money from work, he'll be here any minute." Her cart was full of basic necessities: diapers, baby formula, milk, bread, peanut butter. The children, ranging from about 2 to 7 years old, stood quietly beside her, sensing their mother's distress even if they didn't understand the details. Miguel looked genuinely sorry but helpless. "I'm really sorry, ma'am, but I can't hold the line much longer. There are other customers waiting." Behind the woman, a line of increasingly impatient shoppers was forming. Sarah could see their faces, some sympathetic, others annoyed, most just wanting to complete their own transactions and move on with their lives. A few people checked their phones or watches, making their irritation obvious. "This is ridiculous," muttered a man in a business suit, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people need to learn to manage their money better." The woman's face flushed red with shame. Her oldest child, a little girl with pigtails, tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," the mother said, her voice breaking slightly. "Mommy just needs to figure something out." That's when Frank appeared at the front of the store, having witnessed the entire exchange. Without hesitation, he walked past the line of waiting customers and approached Miguel's register. "How much is her total?" Frank asked quietly. Miguel glanced at the screen. $87.53, sir." Frank pulled out his wallet, the same worn leather wallet Sarah had seen him use dozens of times, and counted out the bills. He handed them to Miguel without fanfare, as if paying for a stranger's groceries was the most natural thing in the world. The young mother stared at him in shock. "Sir, I can't let you do that. My husband really is coming." "I'm sure he is," Frank said kindly. "But these little ones look hungry, and sometimes we all need a hand." The woman began to cry, not from embarrassment this time, but from overwhelming gratitude. "How can I ever thank you? How can I pay you back?" Frank smiled and glanced at her children, who were looking up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Well, I reckon these young ones could give an old man a high five. That'd be payment enough." The children, encouraged by their mother's nod, each stepped forward to give Frank enthusiastic high fives. The littlest one, barely able to walk, gave Frank a hug around his legs that made the old man's eyes water slightly. As Frank helped load the groceries into the woman's car, Sarah noticed something that made her heart ache with recognition. She saw Frank's own cart, sitting by the entrance where he'd abandoned it when he'd seen the situation unfold. His usual modest selection of groceries, probably representing his own careful budgeting, sat forgotten while he helped someone else. The woman drove away with tears still streaming down her face, waving at Frank through her car window. Her children pressed their faces against the glass, waving enthusiastically at the kind man who had helped their family. Frank returned to retrieve his cart, but Sarah intercepted him. "Frank," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "What you just did." He shook his head, looking almost embarrassed by her praise. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. They had both seen the other customers, people with full carts and expensive clothes who had walked past without offering help. People who had made judgmental comments or checked their phones impatiently while a mother struggled to feed her children. Sarah thought about all the times in recent months when she had needed help, really needed it, and how often she had been met with indifference or outright rejection. The bank officers who had spoken to her like she was trying to scam them when she'd asked about loan modifications. The former friends who had stopped calling when her problems became too real, too complicated for casual friendship. The family members who offered advice but no actual assistance. Only Frank had helped. Only this elderly stranger in overalls had seen her pain and responded with pure, uncomplicated kindness. 6 months after their first meeting, Sarah's life had stabilized in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her mother's cancer had gone into remission, not cured, but manageable with the right treatment plan. Sarah had been promoted to assistant manager at the grocery store, and her freelance design business was growing steadily. She had even started dating again, tentatively exploring the possibility of trust and companionship. But more than the practical improvements, something fundamental had shifted in how Sarah saw the world. Frank's kindness had reminded her that goodness existed, that people could choose compassion over convenience, generosity over judgment. She made a point of paying attention now, really paying attention, to the people around her. The elderly customers who counted coins carefully at the register. The young mothers juggling children and budgets. The teenagers who lingered in the store because it was warmer than wherever they were supposed to be. One Thursday evening, as Sarah was closing the store, she noticed a man in his 50s sitting on the bench outside. He was well dressed but had the hollow look of someone whose world had recently collapsed. She recognized the expression immediately. It was the same one she'd worn that day in aisle 7. Without hesitation, Sarah grabbed a bottle of water and a sandwich from the deli counter. She paid for them with her own money and walked outside. "Excuse me," she said gently. "The store's closed, but you're welcome to sit here as long as you need. And I thought you might be thirsty." The man looked up at her with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Thank you," he said quietly. I needed somewhere to think." Sarah sat down beside him on the bench. Sometimes thinking is easier when you're not alone. As she listened to his story, a sudden layoff, a family that didn't understand, a sense that he'd failed at everything that mattered, Sarah heard echoes of her own journey. But more than that, she heard Frank's voice in her own words of comfort and understanding. The man's name was David, and like Sarah before him, he was drowning in circumstances beyond his control. His company had been sold, and the new owners had eliminated his entire department. At 54, he was finding it nearly impossible to find new work in his field. His marriage was strained, his savings depleted, and his confidence shattered. "I know it sounds stupid," David said, staring at his hands, "but I came here because I needed to buy groceries for my family, and I realized I don't have enough money. I've been sitting here for an hour trying to figure out how to tell my wife that I can't even afford milk and bread." Sarah's heart clenched with recognition. She remembered that exact feeling, the shame of not being able to provide basic necessities, the way poverty could make you feel invisible and worthless. "It doesn't sound stupid at all," she said. "And you're not alone." Over the next hour, Sarah found herself doing for David what Frank had done for her, offering practical help without judgment, listening without trying to fix everything, and providing the simple but profound gift of human connection in a moment of crisis. She helped David create a basic grocery list within his budget, shared information about job resources she'd discovered during her own unemployment, and most importantly, reminded him that his current circumstances didn't define his worth as a person. When David finally stood to leave, he had groceries for his family and something even more valuable, the knowledge that someone cared enough to help. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, echoing the words Sarah had spoken to Frank months earlier. "Remember this feeling," Sarah replied, unconsciously repeating Frank's wisdom. "Someday, when you're back on your feet, you'll see someone else who needs help. And maybe you'll remember that sometimes a stranger's kindness can change everything." As Sarah watched David drive away, she felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than herself. She understood now that Frank's kindness hadn't been random or accidental. It was part of a chain of compassion that stretched back through time, connecting strangers across generations and circumstances. A year later, Sarah received an invitation to Frank's 80th birthday party. The celebration was held in the church basement where Frank and Martha had been married 50 years earlier. The room was filled with people whose lives Frank had touched, former coworkers, neighbors, people from the grocery store, and others whose stories Sarah was just beginning to learn. During the speeches, person after person stood to share tales of Frank's quiet generosity. The young mother from the grocery store was there with her 3 children, now older and thriving. She talked about how Frank's help that day had come at the exact moment when she was ready to give up, and how his kindness had reminded her that there were still good people in the world. A man Sarah didn't recognize spoke about how Frank had helped him find work after a plant closure in the 1990s. A woman shared how Frank had fixed her elderly mother's front steps for free after a storm, refusing any payment. Story after story of small acts of kindness that had rippled outward, creating waves of positive change in ways Frank himself probably never realized. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she found herself looking out at faces that reflected her own gratitude and understanding. These were people who had been helped by Frank, yes, but more than that, they were people who had learned from his example. "A little over a year ago," Sarah began, "I was in the darkest place I'd ever been in my life. I was standing in aisle 7 of Hanson's grocery, having a panic attack because I couldn't afford the basic groceries on my list. I felt completely alone, completely hopeless." She paused, finding Frank's eyes in the crowd. He was listening with the same patient attention he'd shown that day in the store. Dozens of people walked past me that day. But only one stopped to help. Only Frank saw a stranger in pain and chose to do something about it. Sarah went on to tell the story of that day, but also of the days that followed. How Frank's kindness had given her not just practical help, but hope. How his example had taught her to see opportunities to help others, to break the cycle of indifference that made people feel invisible in their moments of greatest need. Frank taught me that kindness isn't just about being nice, Sarah concluded. It's about seeing people as worthy of help simply because they're human. It's about choosing to act when action matters most. After the party, as people were saying their goodbyes, Frank pulled Sarah aside. "You know," he said, "Martha would have liked you. She always said the best way to honor a gift is to pass it along." Sarah hugged him then, this man who had become like a grandfather to her. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." Frank patted her shoulder gently. "Thank you for helping me understand why Martha always bought too much food." They both laughed, but Sarah understood the deeper meaning behind his words. Frank's generosity wasn't just about having extra groceries to share, it was about having an extra portion of love, compassion, and hope to offer to those who needed it most. 2 years later, Sarah was in a very different place. She had been promoted again, this time to store manager when Linda retired. Her mother's cancer was still in remission, and they had developed a new relationship based on mutual support rather than Sarah's desperate attempts to save someone who might not be savable. Her freelance design business had grown to the point where she was considering leaving the grocery store to pursue it full-time. But on this particular Tuesday, she was exactly where she needed to be. She was restocking the produce section when she noticed a teenage boy standing in the cereal aisle, staring at the prices with the same desperate calculation she recognized from her own worst moments. He was thin in a way that suggested more than just teenage metabolism, and his clothes, while clean, were clearly secondhand. Sarah watched him for several minutes as he picked up items, checked the prices, and put them back. She saw him count the crumpled bills in his pocket multiple times, his young face marked by a worry that no teenager should have to carry. When the boy finally selected the cheapest loaf of bread and a jar of generic peanut butter, clearly all he could afford, Sarah made her decision. She approached him with the same gentle manner Frank had shown her years earlier. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I'm the manager here, and we're doing a customer survey. Would you mind helping me out by trying some new products? The company wants feedback from younger customers." The boy looked suspicious at first, but Sarah's genuine smile and patient manner reminded him of a teacher he'd once had who had actually cared about her students. "It won't take long," Sarah continued. "And there's a gift card for participating." Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah learned that the boy's name was Marcus, and he was 16 years old. His mother worked 2 jobs but was still struggling to make ends meet after his father had left the previous year. Marcus had started walking to the grocery store after school, using his part-time job money to buy what food he could afford, trying to help out without letting his mother know how worried he was about their situation. "She works so hard," Marcus said, his young voice filled with protective love for his mother. "I just want to help, you know. But there's never enough." Sarah's heart broke for this teenager who was trying to shoulder adult responsibilities, just as she had tried to shoulder the impossible burden of her mother's illness and their financial crisis. "You know what?" Sarah said, echoing Frank's casual tone from that day long ago. "We actually have a position opening up. Part-time, flexible hours, perfect for someone still in school." "Interested?" Marcus's eyes widened. "Are you serious? You'd hire me? We need responsible people," Sarah said. "And anyone who spends his own money trying to help his family sounds pretty responsible to me." But Sarah didn't stop there. Just as Frank had done for her, she found herself adding items to Marcus's small selection: fresh fruit, better bread, some meat for real meals. When Marcus protested, she used Frank's own words. "Consider it an advance on your first paycheck." As Sarah rang up Marcus's groceries at the customer service counter, she caught sight of Frank entering the store for his weekly shopping. He noticed the interaction immediately, and Sarah saw something like pride flicker across his weathered features. After Marcus left with his groceries and the promise of a job interview the next day, Frank approached Sarah with a knowing smile. Looks like someone's been practicing what I preach, he said. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. I learned from the best. No, Frank said, shaking his head. You learned what was already in you. I just helped you remember. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching through the store windows as Marcus walked down the street with his groceries, his step lighter than it had been when he'd entered. Martha was right, you know, Frank said finally. The best way to honor a gift is to pass it along. Sarah nodded, understanding now what Frank had understood years ago, that kindness wasn't just about helping one person in one moment. It was about creating a legacy of compassion that could ripple outward in ways you might never see or fully comprehend. 5 years after that first meeting in aisle 7, Sarah stood in the same spot where her life had changed direction. But now she was there for a different reason. The grocery store was hosting a community appreciation event, celebrating local heroes and everyday acts of kindness. Frank was being honored for his years of quiet service to the community. The stories shared that evening revealed the true scope of his impact, dozens of people whose lives had been touched by his generosity, his wisdom, and his simple belief that everyone deserved help when they needed it. Sarah served as the master of ceremonies, introducing speaker after speaker who had been helped by Frank. The young mother whose groceries he'd paid for had gone back to school and become a nurse. Marcus had graduated high school with honors and was now in college studying social work, with a part-time job at the store that had helped support his family through their difficult years. David, the man Sarah had helped outside the store, was there too. He had found new work, rebuilt his marriage, and had recently started a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping unemployed workers navigate job transitions. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: a moment of crisis, a stranger's kindness, and the ripple effects of compassion that continued to spread long after the initial act. When Frank finally stood to speak, the room fell silent. This man who had asked for no recognition, who had helped countless people while expecting nothing in return, seemed almost overwhelmed by the gathering of lives he had touched. I want to thank you all for coming, Frank began, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. But I need you to understand something. I'm not the hero of these stories. You are. He gestured to the crowd, his eyes touching on face after face of people who had overcome their own struggles. See, the real miracle isn't that one old man helped a few people buy groceries. The real miracle is what happened next. Sarah helped Marcus. Marcus has helped other kids at his school. David started an organization that's helped hundreds of people. And on it goes. Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued. That's how it's supposed to work. One person helps another, and then that person helps someone else. Pretty soon, you've got a whole community of people who understand that we're all in this together. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. My Martha used to say that kindness was like a stone thrown into a pond. You might not see all the ripples, but they keep spreading long after. The stone has sunk to the bottom. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself alone with Frank in the store. The lights had been dimmed, and the familiar aisles stretched out before them like paths through a well-known landscape. Can I ask you something? Sarah said as they walked slowly through the store. Course. That day when you helped me, had you planned it? Were you looking for someone to help? Frank considered the question carefully. No, I wasn't looking for anyone in particular. But I was paying attention. There's a difference. He stopped walking and turned to face her. Most people go through life focused on their own problems, their own needs. And that's natural, we all have plenty to worry about. But if you keep your eyes open, really open, you start to notice when someone's struggling. And once you notice, you have a choice. What kind of choice? Whether to pretend you didn't see it, or whether to do something about it. Sarah thought about all the times she had walked past people in need. All the opportunities for kindness she had missed because she was too wrapped up in her own problems or too afraid to get involved. Why did you choose to help me? She asked. Frank smiled, the same gentle expression she remembered from that first day. Because 40 years ago, a stranger chose to help me. And because 40 years from now, I hope someone will choose to help whoever needs it then. He started walking again, his footsteps echoing softly in the empty store. The thing is, Sarah, we're all just walking each other home. Might as well make the journey a little easier when we can. As they reached the front of the store, Sarah realized that this conversation was itself a kind of graduation. She had learned not just to accept help when she needed it, but to offer it when she was able. More than that, she had learned to see the interconnectedness of human struggle and human kindness. "Frank," she said as they prepared to part ways, "I hope you know how many lives you've changed." The old man adjusted his cap and picked up his small bag of groceries. "I hope you know how many lives you're going to change." With that, he walked out into the evening air, leaving Sarah alone in the store that had become the setting for so many small miracles. Today, 10 years later, the tradition continues. Sarah now owns 3 grocery stores in different neighborhoods, each one run with the same philosophy Frank had taught her: that business could be profitable and compassionate, that communities were built one interaction at a time, that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Marcus works for her as a district manager.